Hey guys, this is G, and today I've got an awesome video for you if you're interested in cell activators. The term cell activator comes from the Bloom technique that was invented by Shelly from Shelly Art, and it's the top layer that goes in the Bloom technique. It's responsible for creating an effect called lacing, and this has become really popular on the internet nowadays. The Bloom technique is probably one of the most popular techniques in acrylic pouring. So I'm going to show you today the original recipe for the cell activator, as well as an alternative recipe that you can use. I guarantee you have the ingredients already. If you want to try getting lacing and maybe you're not ready to commit to buying Australian Floetrol yet. Now, because lacing is generally a difficult thing to achieve and the Bloom technique is one of the harder techniques to pull off, you'll inadvertently always run into like problems tweaking your recipe, or you might be following along with a YouTube video and you find that something is not quite working. So stick around because I'll also show you what problems you might be running into, as well as some variables that you might not be aware of that could be affecting your cell activator or your alternative lacing recipe. So this is how the experiment is going to go. We're going to have a color puddle at a thick consistency as you would in the Bloom technique. And then we're going to have the original cell activator recipe and the alternative lacing recipe. We will look at what they're good at, what they maybe fall short, and how they compare. And you can then make a decision on whether or not you're ready to invest in Australian Floetrol. So the materials we need today are, for the original recipe, we need Australian Floetrol. To tell the Floetrols apart, Australian Floetrol actually looks very different from its European and American counterparts. It has a red label like this, and it also says acrylic paint, not latex paint. American Floetrol looks nothing like the Australian Floetrol. They're both called Flood Floetrol, but as you can see, this one, as I said, this is latex based, and it has the orange label, whereas Australian Floetrol has the red label. Okay. Now, normally, in the original recipe, you would pair Australian Floetrol with Amsterdam. If you're not aware of this brand called Art Creations, this is basically the same company that makes Amsterdam, Royal Tenens. These are actually the same color, but this is the budget line, and this is the Amsterdam that we know and love. This brand costs half as much as Amsterdam does, and it literally does everything Amsterdam does, including create a good cell activator or lacing recipe. So if this is available to you, to be honest with you, it's mostly available in markets on this side of the world, not so much in the States and Europe. But if you are able to find it, this is a very good budget paint. So these are the paints that I'll be using. This will be my base. This will be the cell activator. And we're also going to use these same colors for the alternative lacing recipe. Now, to spare you 5 minutes of me stirring, I'm just going to show you what the paints look like. So the base is going to be about this thick. This is a 3 parts Floetrol or pouring medium to 2 parts paint. This creates a thickness like this. Notice how viscous it is. You can see it mounds, it definitely creates a shape, right? So it's quite thick. And then the actual cell activator recipe is 3 parts of Australian Floetrol and 1 part of paint. So when we talk about, let me take a moment to talk about parts, because I often talk to people who misunderstand parts. So if I tell you a recipe is 3 parts to 1 part, what that means is, first of all, you have to know if we're talking about volume or weight. In this case, I'm talking volume, so you can use measuring spoons, measuring cups. This is called measuring volume. If you're measuring weight, as in using a scale, you have to know that weight and volume don't give you the same thing. If you use 2 parts to 1 part in volume and do the same thing with weight, you'll find the consistency is different. So you need to always know which one you're doing. In this case, so you know, we're doing volume. I'm using measuring spoons. It doesn't matter which one you use, but you commit to the one. So this becomes a part. So 3 parts means 3 spoonfuls of Floetrol, and then 1 spoonful of paint. Right? And then this will give you a consistency that looks like this. This is quite runny. As you can see, comes right off the stick. Doesn't leave any mound, doesn't leave anything on the surface. Okay? So I've labeled both of these tiles for reference so you can easily see which one we're working with at any particular point. I just want to point out we're not going to use a pillow. We're not fully executing the bloom technique right now. In this portion, I'm literally just showing you the reaction of lacing and giving you an understanding of what lacing is. Lacing is what happens when fluids experience what's called the Rayleigh-Taylor instability. The Rayleigh-Taylor instability is a phenomenon of fluid dynamics. It describes how fluids will behave in a stable or an unstable state. Okay, so now as we add the cell activator and the lacing alternative recipe on top of the color puddle, the first thing we want to look at is the edge of the cell activator or the lacing alternative. Okay, notice how the color gets a little fuzzy. What you're seeing is the purple is literally sinking under the yellow. Okay, now I'm going to use a straw to essentially destabilize this. I'm going to push the cell activator around, generally in a down and out motion to stretch it out, right? And as it starts to spread out, you may incorrectly assume that it's the yellow rising. It's actually the purple sinking. And this pattern that it's sinking in is called the Rayleigh-Taylor instability. Now, you are actually able to achieve this with the lacing alternative as well, as I'm about to display now. If your consistencies are correct, the bottom color puddle is thicker than the cell activator or the lacing alternative. You followed the recipes correctly, the consistencies are correct. It actually works with both of them, right? Now, we haven't spun this out yet. Like I said, we haven't used the pillow, so we haven't moved it around. That's not what we're discussing at the moment. What I'm trying to show you here is that you can get this reaction with or without Australian floetrol. But that's not actually what makes Australian floetrol special, right? Some people incorrectly assume that you need Australian floetrol to get this reaction to happen, but that's actually not true. You can achieve it without it. So now I'll show you what's actually in this lacing alternative recipe, and you'll see that you probably already have the ingredients at home. Now, for the alternative recipe, you might be surprised to learn this, but you can actually get a very decent lacing effect with the materials you see on screen right now. A good quality paint and water to thin it down. Now, the reason we have to use a good quality paint is because good quality paints, and even this particular budget paint, because we know they use the same raw materials as Amsterdam do, is you need good pigment and good binders for this effect to work properly. If the binders are not good, which is why most craft paints, or actually all craft paints, don't necessarily work in the lacing or even in the original cell activator recipe, is because the binders in it are just not sufficient to hold it together as you start to stretch it out as you would in the bloom technique, or even if you're using it for a swipe. Now, in this recipe, what we're going to do is we're going to do 1 part of paint to 2 parts of water. Okay, same as before, using our little measuring spoons, whichever one you want, depending on how much cell activator you want to make or how much of the lacing recipe you want to make. 2 of these of water, 1 of paint, and that will give you the alternative lacing recipe. And if I show you this again, I didn't really make much, it's just enough for the test. You see it grounds off the stick, it doesn't leave anything on the surface of the paint. It's definitely thinner than the yellow color that it's going to go on top of, and it is more or less the same consistency as the original cell activator recipe. And you'll find that consistency is crucial, right? And we'll take a closer look at why consistency is crucial, because even if you're using the right materials, if the consistency is off, this will just not work. So in this example, I'm going to repeat the experiment again, but this time the base is going to be thinner, or let's not call it a base. The color, as it would be called in the bloom, the color puddle is going to be thinner than the consistency it's supposed to be. Now, this is going to affect how the cell activator behaves, because what you might not know is that the cell activator has a very direct relationship with what it sits on, as in, even if the cell activator is as close to the correct consistency as can possibly be. If it's sitting on top of a color that's at the wrong consistency, it's still not going to work at all. It may even crack on you. It might not react the same way. It might not react at all, depending on what's thick and what's thin. But in this example, the color puddle is thinner than it needs to be. The cell activator and the lacing recipe are the same as we did in the original example. Now, as we add the cell activator and the lacing alternative into the middle, again, I want you to look at the fuzzy edge called the halo, and notice how a lot more of the purple sinks into the yellow, right? That's because the yellow is too thin to hold the cell activator up, and it's sinking much too quickly. Now, the thing is, we do want it to sink. Sinking is part of the reaction, but if it sinks too fast, it may even disappear on you completely. It might cause that very runny part of paint that sinks into a thicker paint may cause an uneven pocket that cracks on you. Especially if you try blooms or cell activators and you end up with cracks directly over where the cell activator is, that's usually the cell activator sinking into the color puddle and causing it to crack, right? So here, as we begin to repeat the experiment and I push the cell activator out, you'll notice it'll react very much the same way. But if we give it some time, I want you to look at what happens to the lacing in both of them, okay? So as you're seeing, we're getting exactly the type of reaction we want. We have nice cells, we have lacing, it's sinking properly, right? But I want you to notice how the lacing will start to sink very quickly. Like by the time I move on to the next painting, the lacing will have sunk so much that all of the lacing will look like the color of purple sinking under yellow as opposed to the bright purple. Okay, so now I'm going to start spreading out the lacing alternative. And while I do that, I want to point out that here I am using a base, or the color puddle is made with a pouring medium that's not the right pouring medium for the bloom technique. And this is also a very big factor, because in the original bloom technique, you would use a water-based enamel like Behr, mixed with some sort of water-based gloss varnish, a polyurethane gloss varnish like Joe Sonia, for example. And that would make up your pouring medium. You would add acrylic paint, or you would add mica pigments to that. And that would make your pouring medium. And this also contributes to how the cell activator behaves. But I don't have any enamel paint in Egypt, so I can't really display that for you. But here, I've managed to keep the color the same between both experiments to eliminate that as a variable. So look at the cell activator painting. Look at what happened to the lacing. Do you notice how most of the vibrant purple has disappeared, and we're left with what looks like the purple sank under the yellow? This is the problem with the color being the wrong consistency. If the color is the wrong consistency and the cell activator is at the right consistency, it will misbehave as it's doing right now. Like you can see, the same thing is happening to the lacing alternative as well. That's also sinking, because it's not so much about the ingredients. I've said this many times. It's not so much about the ingredients. It's way more about the consistency that the paints are at. Now, with that being said, let me now explain to you why Australian Floetrol is special and why you should consider investing in it if you're interested in doing the bloom technique. So aside from being the original ingredient that's in the original recipe, you have to think of the bloom technique as a sum of parts that come together for it to work best. Especially if you've seen the amazing paintings produced by Shelley or by other people that are close to Shelley, like Lisa Morvan or any of the other people who bloom, you'll notice that there's a wow factor. And that wow factor is achieved by using the right materials, because there's a certain set of properties that's achieved when you use the right materials. That certain set of properties is how well do the paints stretch, how well do they move and travel. I mean, it looks great when you do a blowout at the beginning, but then does it disintegrate when you stretch it out? When you spin it, you get the end result that you want. Do the cells expand properly, or do they warp? You'll find that with the alternative recipes, they're much harder to get to that sweet spot. Whereas when you're using the right ingredients like Australian Floetrol and the enamel and the polyurethane varnish, as in the original recipe, it's much harder to get it to that sweet spot where it behaves correctly. You add that on top of the fact that the bloom technique is probably the hardest technique in all of acrylic pouring, and you're setting yourself up for frustration if this is what you attempt as a beginner, if this is what you start with, right? So the takeaway here is that you can use the alternative recipe to try the technique. You can use it for swipes, for example. You can use it to play around and start small because it's easier on a smaller painting than it is a bigger one. But should you make the decision that you want to learn how to make blooms and make really like wow factor blooms, I'd say it's worth the investment, not just in the right materials, but also in the actual course taught by Shelly to teach you all the ins and outs of the bloom technique. Because if you're going to do the hard technique with the expensive materials, you might as well invest in the course and learn how to do it properly, right? And I can even offer you a discount on the course if you use this code at checkout to get a 15% discount on the course. So there you have it, the cell activator recipe and an alternative that you can easily try at home before deciding to invest in Australian Floetrol. If you like this video and enjoy the level of detail that I explain acrylic pouring in, I encourage you to check out my online course at gpours.com, and you can also find the link in the pinned comments below. I'll teach you everything you need to know about acrylic pouring as a beginner and get you from no knowledge to producing paintings that you love within the span of a few days.